Yeah, she, they.
Okay, cool. On affirmative, we have CSSA. On negative, we have a whole world of Warcraft. The motion reads that as a liberal democracy, we would heavily restrict their MNCs from investing in or expanding into liberal states. Without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Hear, hear.
The investment of MNCs in illiberal states is not only immoral, but it makes corporations more oppressive, and it also hinders any capacity for change in these countries. I'm going to look at a few things in this speech. I'm going to explain why this actually entrenches and solidifies the oppression of these governments and why we have a moral obligation to prevent that. I'm then going to look at why this actually makes corporations more evil and oppressive and why that's in direct contrast to the aspirations and interest of liberal countries. I'm then going to look at the capacity for change in these illiberal states. And lastly, I'm going to look at what this looks like for corporations and what the alternatives to this investment look like. Before that, though, a couple points of setup. Firstly, in terms of what we support and what we think liberal states ought to do. Obviously, when we say heavily restrict, this is pretty close to a ban, although maybe not quite there. So the majority of investment would be restricted, pretty much like a ban. Maybe in some exceptional circumstances, you'd be allowed to invest, but it would be, again, pretty heavily restricted. And we think states should set a series of criteria and conditions that ought to be met in order for corporations to be able to invest in your state again. So this looks like pretty basic things that we don't think we need to really flesh out and elaborate. They're kind of rights and obligations that are already well established in international law, such as freedom to associate, freedom of religion, expression, culture, and whatnot, right? So you know what? And look, obviously there is some cultural ambiguity. We're not gonna deny that, but we think there's enough consensus internationally that we can claim these things. What are the interests of liberal states? Again, relatively straightforward and intuitive. They obviously care about liberal values such as democracy and association, and they have to balance that against the economic interests that they have and their, the regard that they have for corporations. So with that in mind, why is investment currently quite evil and helps these governments, and why do these states have a moral obligation to prevent that? This is for a couple of pretty intuitive and obvious reasons, right? The first is that a huge amount of the money that goes into these states through MNC investment helps those states themselves and often directly helps the officials of those states, right? Because you're able to do things like tax the corporations as they generate profit and revenue. And often that tax, because of the structures of states, goes directly to governments and elites, right? Because unfortunately, corruption does exist in these states. They are able to take a huge amount of that money, and often it enables them to continue to do the very things that are oppressive. Because when you have money, you're able to, employ a bigger police force in order to be able to oppress you. If you have more money, you're obviously able to develop more sophisticated technology to do things like spy on your citizens, right? But secondly, it also gives you legitimacy because you're able to point to certain indicators of economic performance to say, look at this, we are a good state, we have produced X amount of revenue through these corporations. And that means that people are more deferential to you and enable you to get away with your oppression even more. So this just means that the investment of MNCs in these countries solidifies the power and the oppression of these illiberal states, right? But we think that liberal states in particular have a moral obligation to prevent this from occurring, or to at least not be complicit in this. Maybe we cannot change these circumstances, and maybe we cannot change the trajectory towards more liberalization, but we ought not be complicit in this thing from happening, or enabling out the corporations that are inherently tied to our country to go into these illiberal states. And that's for a few reasons. One, because we've already purported to care about these rights. Often liberal states self-label as being liberal. They talk about and espouse certain values. They ought to live up to that. But secondly, often they're tied to a certain history of colonialism and oppression, which means there are certain obligations to the citizens of these states to not continue to fuck them over even more. Thirdly, as a liberal state, often that is synonymous with things like wealth and power, which means you have the capacity to enact change, you have the capacity to create these restrictions, so you ought to do so. And lastly, as I've kind of already hinted at, the relationship between you and MNCs that are established in your country is inherently symbiotic. You have a relationship with them, you've enabled them to exist, and therefore you ought to regulate the way in which they conduct themselves. So you have an obligation not to be complicit in the oppression of citizens that is inherently enabled more when you allow MNCs to operate in illiberal states. But we actually think that corporations are made themselves more illiberal by investing in illiberal states. And there's a premise to understand here, which is that companies need access to these countries more than countries need their investment from corporations. And that means there is a power imbalance, which means that countries can dictate to companies more than the inverse. And that is for a few reasons. One, states are often just larger and bigger. Two, they have access to a whole lot of benefits, such as the ability to borrow money, the ability to be coercive and things like that, versus corporations, which have a number of restrictions. They have to be, accountable to shareholders. They are often regulated and those sorts of things. But there are also just more corporations than states, which means that corporations have to compete in order to get access to states. That means that countries have the capacity to dictate a series of things that they want in order for corporations to have access to their markets, right? And often those conditions are things that are oppressive. They look like not having particularly liberal values in the films that film companies produce. That looks like technology companies having to adapt and have more kind of like, more likely to do things like spy on citizens or adjust their algorithms to be, less open to things like privacy, right? So it is often not the case that companies going in make states more liberal. It is the opposite, which is that those states corrupt the power of corporations. And that then filters down to the ways that those companies interact in the liberal states in which they've been established in the very first place. So it is obviously not in liberal states' interest to have their own corporations be influenced by oppressive behavior, right? And yeah, so, but at the end of the day, we don't think it's our burden to necessarily prove that countries do get more liberal, right? Again, it's just important that we're not complicit in that evil. But we actually think that the mechanism for us is that we establish a criteria for change. Now, if countries do want that investment, they've got a very clear set of conditions that they can look to and say, well, if we want those corporations investing in our country, we have to, enact these certain rights, and that gives them a pretty clear imperative for change. The negative team might say something like, oh, but like exposure breeds understanding and that sort of thing. But I don't think that really applies in a corporation where you've just got people investing in a company. It's not like a corporation like teaches you values and those sorts of things. So I don't think that really applies. And if they want to run like a silly backlash argument, that's obviously pretty silly, given that like these states are already pretty illiberal. There's not like, I just think it seems silly for them to be like, we're going to be more illiberal now because you've denied our investment, right? Lastly, and very quickly, I think corporations will still be fine because they have plenty of alternatives. The reason why they often go into illiberal states now is because they're less regulated. Now they'll have to look to alternative sources, and they're likely to go into developing countries that are slightly more liberal. That is good for those developing countries that are actually established as more progressive states. That benefits them. This is good for everyone. We're very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. Elo?
Can I be heard? Great. Firstly, I'm going to start with some direct responses to the principle. We have a principled claim in our own right, which is that this policy is immoral relativism. We're going to outline a few things. Firstly, The West has obligations to people in these nations themselves, and that obviously if they impoverish these nations and hurt those people as a result of putting this form of sanction, that is something that is immoral. We think as a liberal democracy, as Jess says, you obviously have heightened concerns about, people's dignity, people's living standards in this debate. Often you have ideologies of equity, of sharing resources, rather than just simply benefits going to the top. So if this hurts people in these countries, we think that is a moral failing for the liberal nations who are forcing this policy. Obviously, also, if you are being oppressed civically, then we ought not make that situation worse by denying them development and denying them employment. That is important material to consider in this debate that Jess just entirely misses. Obviously, if people are already oppressed, that is bad. But if we make it worse, that really is no good. That is something that she significantly and she poo-poos very flippantly by being like, well, they're already a liberal, it can't get much worse. Well, obviously it could get worse if the economy tanks. Secondly, the standard for determining whether a nation is good or not is arbitrary and entirely relativist. We think that often what this is code for is developing nations who have not had the luxuries of being able to do things like slavery in order to build up a democracy. We think obviously the sins of Western developing nations are in fact, pretty bad, and obviously it is not the case that illiberal nations are necessarily the worst. Obviously there are a number of sins which are associated with liberal democracies. It is unclear that you can actually call this is a justification for doing this policy and sanctions. Thirdly, it is immoral to prioritize the moral luxury of people in the West and people who are staffing those governments at the expense of people on the ground. That is immoral. Lastly, we also would like to just point to the fact here that it is not always true that liberal democracies are always expansionist. That is, obviously, it is okay for liberal democracies to accept some degree of some degree of nations that are still illiberal. It is not necessarily a loss for us in this debate if those nations remain illiberal. Also, additionally, it is immoral to deny profit to your own people. We think that obviously, the businesses would not be going into these ventures if they were not viable or if they did not pose, significant opportunity for profit. We think that what happens is that often you are, missing out on an opportunity for enriching your own people as the, liberal nation. That is your prime concern, not what is happening in the rest of the world. Obviously, this is a chief concern that goes above any of the obligations that they say when they talk about, well, you need to be concerned about other people. This is a primary one. We think the almighty dollar is king, and as a Western nation, you ought to care about it most. The line has to go up in order to fill your moral obligation to your people. Now, what I'm going to be doing is attacking this principle and generally the negative affirmative strategy in a new way, which is just to suggest that this makes you more complicit in the suffering of people in those countries and entrenches regimes themselves. Jess tries to get out of this implicitly by being like, well, they're already pretty bad. But obviously, if we suggest that they are in new or worse ways, that is still sufficient to win us the debate, because not only do we claim their principle, we also claim the additional harms that accrue from that. There are a number of reasons to suspect this. Firstly, often as a result of crises or perceived economic hardships, regimes are compelled to retaliate by pouring massive amounts of money into their security forces. This is what happened in Cuba during the Cold War. This is what is happening in Russia at the moment as a result of Ukraine sanctions. There is a realignment towards the military, which is catastrophic for these countries. Firstly, because it enables them to do expansionist stuff in the future, which means subjugating more people, as in the case of Ukraine. But secondly, it makes their future growth contingent on military expansion. We think that the policy of Russia going into the Ukraine is only thinkable or only good if Russia has no other alternatives, if it is the only option for Russia to keep its economy afloat. Obviously, that is a significantly higher burden and a higher incentive if that country cannot rely on Western development. That is no good. Secondly, it makes it harder for what push for modernization or liberalization may exist in that country to get any traction. This embarrasses elites in, for instance, Putin's oligarchs who may push for modernization, because firstly, it has shown the West is not dependable. It has massively demonstrated to this nation that in fact the push towards modernization was foolish. But secondly, now it is those who are in local industry who are likely to benefit. So for instance, those who were pushing for isolationism before are now empowered because they are the only people who can rescue the country. Now the West has entirely abandoned it. Okay, now I'm going to be doing an additional reason as to why this is likely to increase the power of state-owned enterprises and lead to more state command over the economy. Firstly, because in times of transition, wealth is often just empirically distributed to state cronies. In the case of Transneft and Ukraine sanctions, that was exactly what Putin sought to do in order to shore up support from those around him, massively redistributed wealth to those around him. This puts dictators in a really sticky position where they now have to pour massive resources into people who will prop them up. That is going to be a circumstance where illiberality, flourishes. Second, it means they will likely turn to other illiberal regimes for help, and those are often state command economies, for instance, in China. So it is likely they will grow in a way where they are no longer dependent on Western wealth, they are no longer dependent on Western capital. But we would note that for these countries, developing state-owned enterprises is catastrophic for people they are oppressing. Why? Firstly, because it's easy to deny resources and essential, utilities to some people. For instance, if you place all of your energy assets in one part of the country that is important for you politically, obviously if people in the other part of the country who are already civically oppressed are now economically oppressed, that is catastrophic for those people. Secondly, these companies may threaten market positions held by the West. So for instance, Russian oil may threaten the ability of the West to sell oil, at prices that are above market prices or what the market would bear. Obviously, there are costs for the West that maybe, accrue as a result of the expansion into state-owned enterprise. That is bad because it provokes harms not only for people on the ground, but for the West themselves. Secondly, we think that this often is going to come as a form of contract. So in times of economic crisis, people fall back in line on the regime because in uncertainty over their jobs, because the Western companies pulled out, they will seek reassurance in the form of authoritarian strongmans. And fourthly, I would note here that this argument misses the point from Jess when she says, well, Western nations can't control conditions in these countries. Of course they can. To the extent that you are an illiberal developing economy, the injection of Western capital is massively good for you. Obviously, you would be willing to do that at almost any cost. If that means, for instance, Western countries dictating the location of their investments, obviously that is preferable to a system where the state gets to decide, basically pick favorites in where it wants those investments to go, to play favorites in the people it wants to protect from economic crisis. These are situations where the regime is consolidated, it destroys dissent in this country and the push of modernization. So obviously, I would then note here, if this means the economies of these nations are worse, that is still a win for us because wealth is a precondition of agitating for change. Obviously, people won't question the regime if they are not financially comfortable. Now, to why this is actually giving up a bargaining chip for the West. Firstly, we think there is a degree of dependency on the West, which means it's often a good bargaining chip. Firstly, because of the influx of capital, but secondly, because there are secondary industries which pop up around the MNC. So for instance, the people who staff Nike's factory or are contractors to Nike obviously still have some degree of clout and are responsible for employment. If you pull out of those economies, obviously that is a massive harm. You can use that threat to get leverage and sanctions in order to provoke that regime towards reform. That means there is a trajectory towards better on our side of the house. Secondly, this means that is a form of diplomacy itself. Jess says, well, people don't like Nike shoes that much. If people get accustomed to Western standards of living and lifestyle, which is necessarily better enterprise could ever provide, then obviously that is a win. That is something that is going to push them more towards, the arc of democracy and the arc of justice. MNCs are important for growth. This pushes these regimes back into patterns of, isolation and repression. We are very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech, DPM.
Can I be heard? Can I be heard? Splendid. First negative wasn't listening to Jess. We told you that the vast majority of the benefits from MNC investment went to the people at the top. The people that you paid off in order to be able to build in a particular area. The people that you paid taxes to that then didn't do anything for their people. The people whose pockets were lined each day these MNCs continued to function. The harm did not accrue to people on the ground. If anything, the people on the ground were saved an eternity of being enslaved by companies that sought to exploit them and sought to work them to the bone to be able to line the pockets of their own. Because that is true, and because that was unresponded to, all of their harms at first negative are contingent upon that. That is to say that they need to prove that we directly harm people on the ground such that their principle holds and all of their practical holds. We tell you that people on the ground are harmed by these MNCs when they go there, but they receive none of the benefits because all of those benefits flow to the elite. So what am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to go through a bit of a rampage and just go through everything they said and explain why it's not very good, and then whip Jess's material that got scant response. The first claim that we hear is that the West has a moral obligation to these people and therefore should not make their lives worse. Obviously, this is contingent on showing that we actually end up making their lives worse, which is no point that they do, but rather we make their lives better by virtue of not enslaving them to companies that seek to exploit them. But secondly, we tell you that we have an incentive, or we provide an incentive for these companies to change in a way that is not true under the status quo, which is to say that wealthy elites who get large kickbacks and concessions from these MNCs, now losing those MNCs, have a vested incentive in changing the structure of their government such that they're able to get those benefits again, because that benefits them on an individualistic level. When you hold that over their head, you have a bargaining chip that you can then use reform that improves the lives of people on the ground. But thirdly, note that when you continue to allow MNCs to invest in these areas, recognize that you strengthen the economy, like you strengthen the elites and their ability to control the economy and just the general proceedings of their country. And such, in the long term, you end up making their lives worse. That falls entirely to us. The second thing they tell us is this is relativism. The first thing I would note is that cultural relativism is stupid. For the reason that if you believe that moral relativism is true, then therefore everything and nothing is moral at the same time. And that is obviously flies in the face of literally every moral intuition that we have. But secondly, I would note that on an objectivist moral perspective, which is the one most intuition said to be based on, I think that FGM is bad, and the vast majority of people probably think that FGM is bad because it is a generally morally objectivist held belief. In the same way that is true, I would argue that liberalism is probably better than being enslaved in a democracy and not getting any representation, any tax money, etc. That was a silly claim. I'll tell you that principle falls out of this debate. The third claim that they give us is you should not deny profit to your own people. And I'm pretty sure that's exactly what the European powers were telling themselves when they went into Africa and enslaved a bunch of people, right? That is obviously, you can deny profit to your people if it comes at the expense of particular moral principles. We tell you that these nations do have very particular moral principles to be liberal democracies. And we say that's important for three reasons. Firstly, because it is a fundamental part of these countries' identities. That is to say that the history of the UK is built on just I suppose being a bastion of liberalism, of being something that stands up for people, of being someone that protected other countries. We say that is very coherent with the identity of the UK and the people who voted for that parliament. But secondly, we tell you that generally the way that Western liberal democracies present themselves on the international stage are as arbiters of justice and are as upholders of Western liberalism. To the extent to which you go back on that, you're probably shooting yourself in a way that is inconvenient for you. The third thing I would note is that people that voted you into power probably did so with the expectation that you would not go, engage in neo-colonialistic endeavors in some other parts of the world, and that there are basic moral tenets that you would abide to. To the extent to which all three of those are true, this principle not only falls flat, but if anything, I suppose, falls in the favor of best appeasing the people of that country. The fourth claim they give us is, these countries will fund money into their militaries, and the mechanism is literally non-existent. But I would note as well, the reason why Russia is funding its military so aggressively is because it's bordering Ukraine and it annexed Ukraine recently. So now it's fearing military action in that area. The reason why China is building up its military is because it wants more presence in the South China Sea, as well as wanting to be competitive with the US. So that example doesn't really work. But secondly, I would tell you that to the extent to which you are able to get away with getting free investment from MNCs, that probably means that you have more money to channel into the military in the first place. The comparative was one where resources like oil, for example, ones that were essential for elites to be important on the global economy, to be able to trade with the US, etc. When those resources were now things that you had to put money out of your own pocket into getting, that means that there was less money directed toward the military. To the extent to which this can be called an argument, we are better able to fulfill it. The fifth claim they tell us is this strengthens anti-Western narratives. I would firstly say that no, it doesn't, because if anything, I would say that it strengthens the Western support within these populations, for the reason that a company from the West has not come in and then enslaved your entire community, has fucked up your water sources, and then has left, and your government has hung you out to dry. So we would say that because that harm doesn't accrue, there's probably a less reason to hate the West. But secondly, I would argue that to the extent to which we are talking about Russia, we're talking about China, anti-Western narratives already probably exist to a fairly large extent. As such, it's probably a wash on either side, maybe marginally better on our side, but I don't think this matters in this debate. The final claim that they give us is, this is a bargaining chip that we can use against these countries. I'm pretty sure Jess, in the first 2 minutes of her speech, explained to you that we were literally holding this investment ransom until these countries changed. If that isn't definitionally what a bargaining chip is, I literally have no idea. At the end of, as far as like the dismantling of their case, recognize that their principal claims fall flat. Their harms don't exist because they have no mechanism, and all of the things that we told you at Jess went unresponded to. Speaking of which, what did we tell you at Jess? We told you that you are morally accountable for damage that is caused by MNCs. We told you that you were complicit in the harm that accrued within these areas, and you've gone through these countries' legitimacy in allowing MNCs to continue to operate there. Importantly, understand that there is an element of direct causality here. That is to say that your economies and your cultural and political milieu allowed that multinational corporation to exist, and then you've unleashed it onto these other parts of the world. And it's like you are directly not only complicit, but responsible for the oppression that you're causing internationally. But we will also tell you that the moral, as an act of motion, it is extremely important for the UK to preserve its national identity, its historical identity, and its democratic mandate, than maybe making a quick buck that was likely to fuck them over in the long term, but give China or Russia or one of their other not friends more power. The third and final claim that we gave you was that this forced liberal countries to change. I think they misunderstood this. They said, no, you are withholding resources from people on the ground. Importantly, the benefits, and this is what I said at the start, but I want to reiterate it so we finally get a response on this negative. Importantly, the benefits that accrue from multinational corporation investment flow to the elites of that country, and that comes from an exploitation of the labor force within that area. When you get rid of that, the cronies and the elites in power who want those resources, who want to line their pockets, now have a vested incentive to make small concessions in the favor of liberal democracy, such that they're able to benefit themselves. At this point in the debate, all of our harms stand. Their principled claim does not exist. I'm somewhat proud to propose.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech, DLO.
Can people hear me? Cool. This case is just woefully weird from this opposition team because they say that when Western corporations enter, all the profits flow to elites. This makes no sense because maybe it does. There are some mitigation mechanisms, i.e. the laws from the Liberal government that make sure that it doesn't always flow to the elite. But the comparative was that it was going to definitely flow to the elites if it came from state enterprises that were controlled by the state and not controlled by any other actor, i.e. it was always controlled by Putin, it was all fully controlled by Xi Jinping. At least under our side, when Apple expands, it is controlled also by the United States, meaning that we can mitigate the amount of capital that flows to the elites. Note that when we utilize Western liberal forms of development, we were able to exclusively do that. Two questions in his speech. One on Western power, and secondly on the principle of oppression. Firstly, on Western power. The first thing we tell you is the West can levy, well, not the first thing, but one of the most persuasive things that we tell you is the West can levy better control over illiberal nations. They don't really respond to this, and they don't really respond because they don't want to make this an interest of the actor. But that makes no sense. It is in the interest of this actor to have more control over these illiberal nations, because firstly, it pushes out China and Russia and stops their expansion and necessarily stops their development. And secondly, it also necessarily favors, it is favorable for many the electoral incentives of politicians to demonstrate they are capable of developing other nations. It is a good talking point for people who want to get elected. Additionally, Given that you are also that there's an incentive to control other illiberal nations, it is only exclusively under our side in which you can do that, because you can utilize these corporations and the threat of these corporations pulling out as a way in which you can control those illiberal nations. For those reasons, we get comparatively better ability to extract concessions from dictators to move towards democracies. We can also extract favors from these nations in perhaps votes in ASN or other like trade union organizations, and even the United Nations. So obviously, this is an important issue in the debate, and the failure to respond to it is bad for them. Second incentive that Western control and power wants is profit. This opposition team does not properly respond when they say, oh, but they care more about the people and they don't care about profit, because profit equals exploitation. Firstly, I will demonstrate why profit does not necessarily equal exploitation. Secondly, money does matter to this actor, because money necessarily is the way in which you develop your nation and in which you can use, like Trump does, as rhetoric for you being a good politician or good, head of country. That is, that you can develop and enrich your own nation. Thirdly, the counterfactual was worse. The counterfactual was China entering these nations and Russia entering these nations with their corporations or their forms of business. What we did was that we pushed them out, and therefore, if you cared about people and no exploitation, you would stop these actors who have manifested bad incentives. That is, they do things like allow slave labor the same way China allows things like sweatshops to occur. So for those reasons, profit is better under our side, and they do not prove that profit is somehow mutually is exclusive to exploitation. But even if it were, they never demonstrated that profit and money for politicians was not important. The third thing they tell you about Western power is that the military is probably something that you'll have to pour money into in order to expand your economic capabilities and economic power, because the military is the way in which you can utilize geographical power and use that as a bargaining chip and levying chip against nations. Firstly, the military is incredibly inefficient, because the military necessarily requires you to engage in bad conduct, that is perhaps even wars or skirmishes, some sort of battles. And secondly, it is not popular to do those things. Given that that's the only way in which you are capable of being able to push these nations to take on Western corporations, that is worse because it is more expensive, and also it is probably bad because it invokes your principle of stopping, of not doing neocolonialism. At the end of that issue, we demonstrate that Western power is important, and we're the only team that actually engages in actually capturing it. Second issue on oppression. This is more directly responsive with their team. Firstly, I'll talk about dictators. The opposition says that capital goes to corrupt states, and therefore we should stop empowering them, allowing MNCs to enter these nations in order to stop empowering dictators. Firstly, it is immoral to pull out capital and development for these nations. So obviously that means that maybe it's true that perhaps dictators are utilizing this money, but it's not as if dictators aren't doing things like building roads and aqueducts and making sanitation better for their nations. Maybe they are entrenching power, but the development of their people is also important. But secondly, we think that this is comparably worse where oppressive governments engage in homegrown businesses. That is to say, when state-controlled enterprise crops up, that means that you will always have a Russian business directing its profits to Russia, because Russia is literally an oligarchy and a plutocracy. That means that you will always be funding Russian governments through this way. At least under our side, when Apple enters Russia, it means that the profits are largely going to stop being sent to the elites, and more probably going to be doing upskilling its workforce, because these corporations only want to upskill their workforce. It's the best way in which they can make profits. Secondly, they say, well, it provides legitimacy to dictators, and that's bad. Unclear why this is not going to happen when they do state-grown businesses. Unclear why that is not symmetric when China and Russia enter these nations. They then say, this doesn't they don't make life worse, unresponsive to all the material that we give you about homegrown nations, homegrown business. But additionally, I think when China engages in One Belt, One Road initiatives with smaller illiberal nations, that repayment of that, of the loans that China gives necessarily equals austerity. China is not a great actor in this debate, but that is the counterfactual for this affirmative team for what corporations are going to build them up. It is better to have these Western or liberal nations. The second thing I'll talk about in this issue is about corporate corporate actions. They say that corporations will do this investment badly. Firstly, they are accountable because most corporations have liberal bases. When Apple engages in terrible conduct, when Nike does, there is social media backlash, and when social media backlash occurs the same way it did to Snapchat, investors pull out. Kylie Jenner was a threat to Snapchat's profitability. So it is likely that these corporations will not engage in terrible and awful activity. And secondly, we think that governments will apply penalties. That is to say that when First Affirmative says we will have expression and rights, that and those corporations will have to have that in order for the exception to apply to them to enter these countries, we can also make that the requirement for MNCs to enter these nations, and we can apply the penalties to countries that don't do that. Secondly, they say that illiberal nations will dictate MNC conduct. Firstly, that's even with undesirable conditions, illiberal nations will concede to development by these multinational corporations. Unclear why countries like, unclear why countries like Poland won't be happy to have Nike or perhaps Apple growing their economy. Secondly, I think it is unresponsive to the fact that liberal governments can control their MNCs from abroad. That looks like criminal sanctions, and these illiberal governments will give up the MNC. Like CEOs will literally go to prison. They have no incentive to do this if we have liberal governments implying these sanctions. They then say the West they might say, well, the West won't properly regulate because there's no incentive to regulate bad behavior. But Second Affirmative concedes that there are big values about democracy and treating people well. So obviously they do have an incentive if Second Affirmative is correct. But secondly, I would say that even if there is some exploitation, they don't engage in the comparative where there was going to be even worse exploitation and where people were not going to be developed because these corporations had an incentive in trying to build up their the elites and not the people on the ground. At the conclusion of this, they never proved that dictators will change under their side. They never proved that the West had an incentive to do what they're saying. West is more powerful under our side. The West is therefore having more interest in implementing our model. Urge you to negate.
Okay, thank you for that speech, GovWhip.
Can I be heard? Cool. Here's what is so frustrating about this negative team case. It is not the 1990s anymore. Multinational corporations and investment from multinational corporations is not the main driver of economic growth in the states listed in first slide, or really in a lot of states generally, which is to say, Poland has Nike. It's not worried about losing Nike. China has a whole bunch of other very big companies. So does Russia. These places have large domestic markets and are relatively middle income countries, which is to say, side negative can't throw literally the most generic developing nation analysis and say, well, MNCs are important for growth and growth makes nations more liberal, and that's a very good thing. And MNCs hold enormous sway over the policies of developing nations, because quite simply, the West, or a liberal democracy anywhere, does not have the capacity to dictate internal Chinese domestic policy, because China is big and economically developed. And moreover, the thesis that we hear from first and negative, like the reason that they claim that these states will get more liberal over time, the liberal states will get more liberal over time, is because MNCs will invest, they will grow, and as the first negative said, wealth is a precondition to liberalness. If that is true, China would have grown significantly more liberal over the past 20 years, and so would Russia. But that is not true, because authoritarian states, when they're capable of providing economic growth, or at least appearing or providing a simulacra of economic growth, they become significantly more able to justify and legitimate their rule to the people that they control. The first thing I'm going to ask in this speech is, what are the priorities of a liberal state? I will clarify what I think those priorities ought to be. I'll explain how we win the debate quite neatly on one of those priorities that never really received sufficient response from side negative. And the next thing I'll do is pivot towards what I think both teams fought the most over in this debate, which was which side benefits the population of the liberal states. So, onto the priorities of liberal state, of a liberal democracy. the first thing we hear from side negative is that liberal democracies worship the almighty dollar, and therefore, if they can prove that liberal democracies would profit more under their side of the house, then they win. The first thing I would note is that To No Response Jess already outlined that there were alternative sources for investment. There are other countries you could direct your investment towards that the companies may not were initially interested in because it harmed their regulation, but over time could prove to be quite profitable. Companies don't have a perfect, multinational corporations don't have a perfect information about the future, and therefore they could invest. This could direct them to invest in other places, which ends up being more profitable. The second thing I'd note, though, is that generally, like in liberal democracies, we don't allow someone to profit over something that is wholly or entirely immoral or over the exploitation of another, which is to say, their argument that if it is true that the primary goal of a liberal democracy is like the almighty dollar, then liberal democracies would not have corporation taxes, but obviously they do. So it's clear that while money might be important to some liberal democracies, there's something deeper going on here. Our claim here is that liberal democracies value their liberalness because it's an important part of their self-conception as to who they are, and they need to feel that they're doing right by that liberalness and actualizing that principle, right? If you feel something very strongly about your sense of self, the best way to reaffirm and retrench that is to do things that align with that thing about yourself, right? I believe I'm a debater. I go to a debate. I do debating. I hopefully do well at debating tournaments, and then I feel like I'm more of a debater. I feel like that identity is more clearer to me. That's how liberal states are clearly operating here. But the other thing we note is they also care about preserving their own liberalness and not losing the geopolitical power stakes. And this is where the negative team become unstuck, because they did not at any point respond to the argument that is made at Jess, not at first negative or at second negative. Check your notes. Because we claimed that multinational companies will become dependent upon these particular states and the markets that those states control. What do I mean by this? Hollywood and
Frozen. I've got that frozen at 4 o'clock. Is this frozen for you guys too?
film production companies on the west coast of America. Hello?
Hi, Brendan. Sorry. You said that's at Hollywood, and then you cut out. So if you just go from Hollywood at 4 minutes.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Sorry, one second. Sorry. It is very hard in Hollywood to make a film that is critical or not even mildly pro-China, because the Chinese domestic film, like movie market, is the largest market outside of the US that Hollywood has to cater to. Like Mad Max Fury Road, which is a phenomenally successful film in the West, was not allowed to be released in China, and it didn't make all of its money back. It made its initial production budget back, but it did not make the entire marketing budget back. Like that movie, which is phenomenally successful, lost money because it didn't have access to the Chinese market. In a similar way, Apple has its entire supply chain deeply interlinked with the various, like the vagaries of the Chinese market, and the Chinese state, which is one of the fears in the trade war, the Chinese state could just clamp down on Apple's ability to make iPhones, which would be incredibly damaging to the American economy. The point is that economic interlinkage goes both ways. And what we've observed over the past, I would say 20 years, is that multinational corporations investing in illiberal states has not made those states more liberal. It has made Western democracies less liberal and has left them more open to manipulation by those states. Because as we clarified, to no response from either negative speaker so far, we told you that it meant that their lobbyists now potentially were trying to at least navigate the desires of China, which meant that China kind of implicitly had some kind of sway within Congress, because Apple and Google's and Facebook's lobbyists were attempting also to work for them. It also meant, right, the economic capacity of some Western liberal states to grow was also contingent upon the internal domestic policies of these particular states, all of which is to say that Western liberal democracies potentially become captured and become suspect to illiberal states, precisely because their businesses and some of the most profitable corporations are reliant on access to markets those illiberal states control. So it is not immediately obvious, right, that this actually benefits liberal states or economically or domestically. But let's move on and examine exactly whether this benefits the people in question here, right? The people within illiberal states, because the primary claim we heard from the other side was this was about benefiting those states and making them benefiting the people in the states and making those states more liberal. two things I would note that are actually kind of distinct. I'll explain here. The first thing here is they premise their case on the idea that MNCs benefit local populations and local economy and the local economies in these places, but never explain it. They never explain why investment in this particular way actually is beneficial. We point to the fact that a lot of the investment goes to paying off various bribes, like the person who controls the water board in the part of southern China, as opposed to the local population. Often there is a lot of pollution involved because multinational corporations have, in the liberal states, there are lower regulations about pollution levels and that sort of thing. And notably, local political elites can show them shaking hands with the Western CEO and being like, we are providing economic goods, which enshrines the legitimacy of that reign and perpetuates it on into the future. Note, that claim that multinational companies drive the economic growth of these places and they would shudder to a halt without them is what props up their harms about these places becoming more militaristic, is what props up these harms about these companies developing large state-owned organizations. All of which is to say is premised on the idea that MNCs benefit these countries. But as I've already explained, these countries are very large, have large domestic markets, and have the fact they have their own SOEs is indicative of the fact that they are quite powerful economically in and of themselves. But notably, the benefits of MNCs don't necessarily flow to the people involved. The next thing though, and this is important, is that growth does not necessarily make a state more liberal, and what the preference of a liberal democracy may not necessarily be the economic short-term benefits of the people in that state. Which is to say, a liberal democracy wants more liberalness worldwide because liberal democracies rarely fight with each other, and that's important for liberal democracy, but also because they believe in the principles of liberalism. They don't necessarily believe in economic growth in certain parts of rural Siberia. And that is important. If we can prove, as we think we have, growth and MNC investment enshrines legitimacy in those places, even if it benefits them economically, it does not benefit this, like liberal democracies and their conception of what liberalness means. Their claim was, we'll make this simple trade-off where it's like, yes, illiberal states remain, but liberal democracies benefit because the people grow, and that discharges their moral obligation. No. This is an active debate, and liberal democracies have a preference for states becoming more liberal, not necessarily states becoming more economically prosperous. And allowing MNCs to invest entrenches the power of local political elites, and notably does not make states more liberal. The last 20 years are evidence of that.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Upwit.
Can you hear me? Cool. Panel, Brendan's intros that said Poland has Nike, China has a bunch of other corporations, and then the later claim that MNCs can always go to other countries to find investment actually just gutters their case and chokes their only mechanism to getting more liberal democracies out there. Because at the point where all of that was true, it meant that the MNCs having conditions upon to which they can reinvest into a country, this was unlikely to be able to affect these illiberal nations in any meaningful way or form if there were already other alternatives there, which therefore meant that the affirmative team's only pathway to victory was this incredibly wishy-washy principle about moral complicity, which was essentially, as we tell you on side negative, equivalent to turning a blind eye to the potential of future suffering in illiberal nations. Therefore, the first thing I'm going to do to you is to prove to you why we are likely to get more change on the outside, and that secondly, why it will get significantly worse on the outside. So let's look at the two mechanisms we give you from Matt, which would go unresponded to, right? Because we tell you that companies do not invest in countries unless there is some form of economic confidence, that they have, trade, there's travel, there are regulations, and there is a legal system to litigate commercial disputes, which therefore means that at the point where that is true, a company or an MNC has an incentive to make sure at least institutions of accountability and institutions which affect them are likely to be stable and likely to be good, and as a result can change behavior. This is for the reason why Hong Kong still has some freedom, because it is a proxy of business for China, and China needs to give MNCs a bit of wiggle room in order to succeed there. And the second thing to be said is the affirmative's kind of main thing about why they can't change is just that MNCs capitulate to countries because there is a power imbalance, but we tell you that countries also have an economic stake in MNCs, right? Because they assist growth. For example, China's opening in the 1990s and its latter growth was dependent upon MNCs investing in that. And as so, they have an incentive to kind of want that and to kind of want to keep the capital there. But note here, few more reasons why the bargaining chip analysis just simply does not work, right? Because at the point where you pull out entirely and you already concede there are already homegrown companies who can fill the void, we tell you that firstly, countries have an incentive to save face instead of capitulating to Western nations because it makes them look weak. I think secondly, they're also just likely to retaliate badly, right? Because often economies of different nations are mutually reinforcing. So for example, Russia has all of Europe's natural gas in their hands, and if you get rid of MNCs, they might just cut your gas. China also could just sanction a bunch of nations if they wanted to. And at the point where liberal democracy maybe cares about liberal values and maybe cares about other people, they probably care about their own survival a lot as well and making sure that their own economies and own countries are prospering too. And at the point where that was true, it was probably a bad strategy for liberal nations to just pull out completely and restrict investments. But here's where we really kick them in this debate, and that is on the counterfactual. Because even if it was true that MNCs mean the countries get because even if all the above was true, that maybe it was a decent bargaining chip, we tell you under the counterfactual, everything that could emerge instead of MNCs were going to be far more worse. We tell you it looks like homegrown companies, it looks like state command, and it looks like militarism. Going through each of these individual mechs on why homegrown companies are likely to come forth. Because, for example, if you restrict the ex-social media industry from expanding in an ex-illiberal country, obviously a state-owned social media company just comes in and replaces it. You see that in China with like kind of the internet splintering off and having their own domains such as Weibo instead of using stuff like Facebook, which therefore means all of the affirmative harms about all the concessions a MNC makes to a liberal country was just going to be more true when it was a homegrown company who has the incentive to go along with state policy and state values there, which is why it was likely to be a lot worse. And then just secondly, Matt gives you the mechanisms with the issues of state command, right? Because in a transition when there's a bit of economic instability, the state typically comes in. And in like states like China and Russia, where it is predominantly big government, that does seem more likely. And we tell you that was really bad because it meant that it increases states' capacity to misallocate assets to groups which they didn't really care about. So, for example, China now has the ability to cut off supplies from Xinjiang because they don't like Uyghur Muslims. And at the point where that was true, it was probably going to hurt the people a lot more and probably going to result in more sorts of crackdown and more illiberalism being growing in these countries. And as a result, countries become more insular, they become more isolationist, they're more likely to distrust Western companies, and it meant the lives of those were going to be far more worse, and they cannot fulfill any sort of ideal of liberal democracy, which they wanted to espouse so much. But now to the second world, which kind of happens, which could potentially happen. And that is to say, when a country no longer has economic legitimacy, they are also likely to just go to military legitimacy in order to derive popular support. The incentives we give you are quite clear, right? Because firstly, there is an incentive that in times of economic downfall, expansionism and war is a way to keep the economy going. For the reason why illiberal countries are typically quite militarist, as you can see, Russia invading Crimea and Ukraine, and China making incursions into the Southeast Asian Sea. But I think also secondly, that there is also a way to gain popular support, or is at least a distraction from current economic problems, which means that they probably need to have a strong arm image, and as a result, are more likely to go to war. I think that notably, thirdly, there's also just an important mechanism here that we want to avoid conflict. And at the point where two countries have strong economic ties, where MNCs are operating in a certain illiberal nation, it means that both countries have a commercial stake in each other, and means there is a significantly decreased chance of war. And even if there was conflict, it was going to be a lot more better. So for example, China and the USA are engaging in a trade war, as opposed in an actual war, which will obviously result in more bloodshed and more deaths there. It is not great, but at least it is better than what these countries are likely to resort to and likely to do. So at the end of this, I've proven to you why our mechanism has a higher chance of success than their mechanism of bargaining, and that also, in absence of MNCs, every single word out there that could happen was going to be significantly worse, and I just don't think we ever get a substantial response from side affirmative on that. Now, secondly, on the impacts of the people, because this was somewhat contested here, right? So what do you hear first from affirmative? They tell you MNCs are likely to, They're either all the money goes to people on the top, or they do exploitation, and that is bad. Obviously, this misses the benefits we give you from Jerry and from Matt, where we tell you that on the whole, if we have a good economy and good economic growth, that was going to benefit the people on the ground the most. Whether that looked like more employment for people, whether that looked like the state having more money to be able to build better infrastructure, whether it meant that they were able to provide more useful services, that was obviously going to increase the livelihoods of people as compared to if MNCs were not there. And that once again, we have to come back to the comparative. In absence of this, the homegrown companies and state-owned companies were probably just going to do far more worse things than the MNCs there. Now, what is the impact of this argument, right? We told the impact of this argument is people on the ground suffer more. And if you do care about people becoming more liberal and countries becoming more liberal, we told you the most effective way to do this is for people to agitate from within and people to seek and demand their own rights here. I think it is empirically untrue for Brendan to say that these countries have become more illiberal when there is agitation in nations like China, where people in the internet have agitated for Me Too reforms, have agitated for a civil sexual assault lawsuit to be able to a legitimate cause of action. It is possible for them to get change, but they at least need to have a capacity for their own subsistence and the capacity to have a reasonable good life in order to be able to try to change the government and try to get reform there, right? And we secondly tell you that this also guts the movement of any kind of liberal actors in the country already, right? Because at the point where the West pulls out and decides to abandon the country because they are so antithetical to their values, it means the country is likely to become more insular and less likely to westernize or less likely to adopt any liberal values there. So as a result, when you antagonize one country, when you create more anti-West sentiment, it's unlikely you're able to influence future nations in any way or form. And as a result, at the end of this day, we prove to you this is better for the people, this is better for the liberal nations, and this is the highest chance of success to even getting these countries to get them better. Therefore, very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for that speech. And to close the bench, I'll reply.
Can I be heard? Great. The first question I'm asking in reply is, does this shore up regimes? We can win the debate right here because then affirmative fails its principal burden not to be complicit in causing harm or any more degree of liberalness in these countries. We provide a suite of reasons. Firstly, that this embarrasses elites who may be pushing for modernization, so they are shut out. Secondly, because this provokes unequal state investment in places that are strategically important. And thirdly, because this likely leads to nationalist backslide. These only get very meager response in basically Brendan's speech when he says that companies rely on illiberal markets too much, which means that the West may end up toothless. The problem here is, though, one of comparative. The scale of harm of the West, perhaps being dependent in some ways on these countries, is not as large or as transformative as the scale of, a liberal backslide that we point out throughout our speeches. Secondly, Jerry provides a good response to this when he says you would likely regulate operations so this doesn't happen. And thirdly, I would note that this is a knife of Jess's speech. When she says that these companies could invest anywhere, Brendan concedes this is not the case, and so goes that benefit. So what this means is that likely, in fact, the sorts of liberal backslide we are talking about are qualitatively significantly different to the ones that they are talking about. We are talking about generational transitional change, a redistribution of wealth from those who are, maybe a little bit well off to those who are massively well off, a redistribution of power centers geographically to those who are already powerful, and a marginalization of people. What they have to offer under this question is literally maybe Disney kowtows to censorship and edits Star Wars. I ask you to compare those things. I think it is pretty clear who is coming out ahead. The next question in this reply is just to kind of shore up a few other paths to victory. Additionally, if we can prove that this threatens people in third nations, so those ones who are neither the ones who are pulling out or the ones who are being pulled out of, then we also win, because obviously these are likely to be liberal nations just on the numbers, so it is clear that there is an incentive for the actor there. First, we prove this in two ways. Firstly, when we say that this makes economic growth contingent on militarism, Kat gives you a list and a litany of examples of where this has been the case and notes and brings back a number of mechanisms from my speech to prove this. Secondly, we also note that this makes firms less profitable because obviously there are specific, factors of those illiberal markets which make them particularly profitable because, as Brendan concedes, those are the ones that they have the revealed preference for. So this is probably bad for people at home and your allies because you are less wealthy. Third states who are not otherwise at risk but for this policy are jeopardized as a result of it. This is a big harm in the debate that affirmative very little recognizes, because obviously these are ones that are not currently complicit. So if we are putting those in harm's way, that is bad and fails their policy. But secondly, an environment of conflict and confrontation is not good. If this results in more militarism, it is likely going to draw liberal nations to do things that are bad, that are immoral. Liberal nations are particularly conflict averse. If this brings them to the point of confrontation with powers that are already illiberal, that is something that liberal nations are loath to avoid. We think it is something that is in fact debate winning for side negative. But now I'm going to prove some additional things, which is how we also win on the principle. There is very scant response here, particularly to our argument about profit obligation, but I'll still engage in good faith. In Deepak's speech, he said, well, you can't profit immorally. It is unclear that this is actually the case. If you asked the UK if they were happy about colonialism, they would probably, maybe through gritted teeth say yes. Obviously, that is, not necessarily good for the people they are oppressing, but is still, in the grand scheme of things, a win for them. It is not necessarily, the case that the way up falls on the side of morality versus profit, as Deepak says. But additionally, I would note that Jerry does a few things in his speech to suggest that this is not the case. Firstly, that Western nations generally believe in their own exceptionality. He says that this is likely to be something that is important to giving aid to these nations and shoring up their domestic economies. So if this team at any point concedes this is likely to constrict the economic growth of the liberal nations, then side negative automatically loses the debate. But they lose it earlier by making sure that these regimes backslide and additionally threatening third countries. For those reasons, negative takes it.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. Now to wrap up the entire house, Gov reply.
You can hear me all right? In this reply, I'm going to look at outcomes in illiberal states and liberal states. But before I do, I just quickly point out the stuff about cultural relativism. I'm pretty sure that the negative team decided to drop this because they didn't speak about this after first. But I'd say their own material about outcomes will get worse suggests that they do think there is some value we can ascribe to outcomes and the way in which they shape liberal values. So that's probably just worth pointing out. Also, their stuff around like war and destabilization felt a little bit late to me, so I'm not going to talk about it as much, but I think the links weren't there in any case. I'm not sure how we jump from like, MNCs pull out to states like want to go to war with each other the next day. That seems like a bit of a jump, and I don't think that was quite established. So let's look at illiberal states now, because we have some pretty clear material about the fact that when an MNC invests in a liberal state, it solidifies the power of oppressive governments by giving them money to enable them to continue that oppression and also legitimacy. And I'd say that that applies, and the complicity that liberal states ought to be aware of applies regardless of whether things might get worse or not, because you can be sure that you were complicit in that oppression, whereas everything that negatives say about why it might get worse is highly speculative and outside of your control, but you can control the extent to which you give money and you give legitimacy, and states should care about that. But let's engage with them nonetheless, because they had a number of reasons as to why this apparently gets worse. They say that you lose a bargaining chip. But that point is insane to me, because a bargaining chip is literally our case. That is literally our point, which is that we say, here is a set of very clear conditions, and as soon as you implement any one of them, we will allow investment in your country again. If that is not the clearest bargaining chip, I do not want to know what is. They then say that it's bad for these countries because you deny the people on the ground economic benefits. But we explained that that is a very idealistic and unrealistic conception of how benefits are likely to flow. At best, you might get some extremely poor, low-paying, exploitative jobs, but the majority of money and the majority of benefits are likely to flow to elites and government individuals, right? And we'd say that that is probably still less important than the fact that states are oppressing people. Having a little bit of money on the table does not overcome that. The last thing they say is that you'll now get worse alternatives propped up, like state-run industries, like worse actors investing. But that ignores the important context which we give you in a number of speeches, which is that this is not the 1990s anymore. Countries are increasingly diversified, and they are not solely reliant on these corporations. And like intuition pump, just look at the very countries they talk about, China, Russia, they have state-owned enterprises already. I don't know why you think it gets comparatively a whole lot worse. They also kind of mentioned half-heartedly stuff about exposure, but I preempted this in my speech by pointing out that exposure theory doesn't really work with corporations because they have very little influence on the ideology of states. So you're still complicit, and it's unlikely that things get any worse. In fact, they have every chance of getting better because of the bargaining chip, which we explain, and they do not negate in their case. Now let's look at liberal states, because essentially their argument is poor corporations, right? We tell you they will be fine. Maybe they will get some less profit. Sure, we concede that, but there are plenty of alternatives that exist. I'm not sure what Brendan supposedly conceded at third. I didn't hear him say that. I think all we just said is that there is sufficient alternatives out there. They will be just fine. But importantly, the importance of substantive material we give you is that it actually distorts the liberalness of corporations, which are inherently tied to liberal states through a number of different power imbalances. The only response that they have to this is to say that liberal states can regulate this, but it is unclear how they do so. How do you regulate a film company into making them like critique China? That mechanism was deeply, deeply unclear. Like, I'm not going to do any weighing here because I think we win on all fronts. Very proud to propose.